There was no day for him now, and there was no night. There was but a long stretch of time, that was very short, and then the end. Toward no one in the world did he feel any fear now, for he knew that fear was useless, and toward no one in the world did he feel any hate now, for he knew that hate would not help him. Though they carried him from one police station to another, though they threatened him, persuaded him, bullied him, and stormed at him, he steadfastly refused to speak. Most of the time he sat with bowed head, staring at the floor, or he lay full length upon his stomach, his face buried in the crook of an elbow, just as he lay now upon a cot with the pale yellow sunshine of a February sky falling obliquely upon him through the cold steel bars of the 11th Street police station. Food was brought to him upon trays, and an hour later the trays were taken away untouched. They gave him a package of cigarettes, but they lay on the floor unopened. He would not even drink water. He simply lay or sat, saying nothing, not noticing when anyone entered or left his cell. When they wanted him to go from one place to another, they caught him by the wrist and let him. He went without resistance, walking always with dragging feet, head down. Even when they snatched him up by the collar, his weak body easily lending itself to be handled, he looked without hope or resentment, his eyes like two still pools of black ink in his flaccid face. No one had seen him save the officials, and he had asked to see no one. Not once during the 3 days following his capture had an image of what he had done come into his mind. He had thrust the whole thing back of him, and there it lay, monstrous and horrible. He was not so much in a stupor as in the grip of a deep physiological resolution not to react to anything. Having been thrown by an accidental murder into a position where he had sensed a possible order and meaning in his relations with the people about him, having accepted the moral guilt and responsibility for that murder because it had made him feel free for the first time in his life, having felt in his heart some obscure need to be at home with people, and having demanded ransom money to enable him to do it, having done all of this and failed, he chose not to struggle any more. With a supreme act of will springing from the essence of his being, he turned away from his life and the long train of disastrous consequences that had flowed from it, and looked wistfully upon the dark face of ancient waters upon which some spirit had breathed and created him. The dark face of waters from which he had been first made in the image of a man, with a man's obscure need and urge, feeling that he wanted to sink back into those waters and rest eternally. And yet his desire to crush all faith in him was in itself built upon a sense of faith. The feelings of his body reasoned that if there could be no merging with the men and women about him, there should be a merging with some other part of the natural world in which he lived. Out of the mood of renunciation there sprang in him again the will to kill, but this time it was not directed outward toward people, but inward upon himself. Why not kill that wayward yearning within him that led him to this end? He had reached out and killed and had not solved anything, so why not reach inward and kill that which had duped him? This feeling sprang up of itself, organically, automatically, like the rotted hull of a seed forming the soil in which it would grow again. And under and above it all, there was the fear of death before which he was naked and without defense. He had to go forward and meet his end like any other living thing upon the earth. And regulating his attitude toward death was the fact that he was black, unequal, and despised. Passively, he hungered for another orbit between two poles that would let him live again, for a new mode of life that would catch him up the tension of hate and love. There would have to hover above him, like the stars in full sky, a vast configuration of images and symbols whose magic and power could lift him up and make him live so intensely that the dread of being black and unequal would be forgotten, that even death would not matter, that it would be a victory. This would have to happen before he could look them in the face again. A new pride and a new humility would have to be born in him, a humility springing from a new identification with some part of the world in which he lived, and this identification forming the basis for a new hope that would function in him as pride and dignity. But maybe it would never come. Maybe there was no such thing for him. Maybe he would have to go to his end just as he was, dumb, driven, and the shadow of emptiness in his eyes. Maybe this was all. Maybe the confused promptings, the excitement, the tingling, the elation, maybe they were false lights that led nowhere. Maybe they were right when they said that black skin was bad, the covering of an ape-like animal. Maybe he was just unlucky, a man born for dark doom, an obscene joke happening amid a colossal din of siren screams and white faces encircling lances of light under a cold and silken sky. But he could not feel that for long. Just as soon as his feelings reached such a conclusion, the conviction that there was some way out surged back in him, strong and powerful, and in his present state, condemning and paralyzing. And then one morning a group of men came and caught him by the wrists and led him into a large room in the Cook County morgue, in which there were many people. He blinked from the bright lights and heard loud and excited talking. The compact array of white faces and the constant flashing of bulbs for pictures made him stare in mounting amazement. His defensive indifference could protect him no longer. At first he thought that it was the trial that had begun, and he was prepared to sink back into a dream of nothingness. But it was not a courtroom. It was too informal for that. He felt crossing his feelings a sensation akin to someone he had had when the reporters first came into Mr. Dalton's basement with their hats on, smoking cigars and cigarettes, asking questions, only now it was much stronger. There was in the air a silent mockery that challenged him. It was not their hate he felt, it was something deeper than that. He sensed that in their attitude toward him they had gone beyond hate. He heard in the sound of their voices a patient certainty. He saw their eyes gazing at him with calm conviction. Though he could not have put it into words, he felt that not only had they resolved to put him to death, but they were determined to make his death mean more than a mere punishment, that they regarded him as a figment of that black world which they feared and were anxious to keep under control. The atmosphere of the crowd told him that they were going to use his death as a bloody symbol of fear to wave before the eyes of the black world. And as he felt it, rebellion rose in him. He had sunk to the lowest point in the side of death. But when he had felt his life again threatened in a way that meant that he was to go down in the dark road a helpless spectacle of sport for other, he sprang back into action, alive and contending. He tried to move his hands and found that they were shackled by strong bands of cold steel to white wrists of policemen sitting to either side of him. He looked round. A policeman stood in front of him and one in back. He heard a sharp metallic click, and his hands were free. There was a rising murmur of voices, and he sensed that it was caused by his movements. Then the eyes became riveted on a white face, tilted slightly upward. The skin had a quality of taut anxiety, and around the oval of white face was a framework of whiter hair. It was Mrs. Dalton, sitting quietly, her frail waxen hands folded in her lap. Bill remembered as he looked at her at that moment of stark terror, when he had stood at the side of the bed in the dark blue room, hearing his heart pound against his ribs, with his fingers upon the pillow pressing down upon Mary's face to keep her from mumbling. Sitting beside Mrs. Dalton was Mr. Dalton, looking straight before him with wide eyes, open, unblinking. Mr. Dalton turned slowly and looked at Bigger, and Bigger's eyes fell. He saw Jan, blonde hair, blue eyes, a sturdy, kind face looking squarely into his own. Hot shame flooded him as the scene in the car came back. He felt again the pressure of Jan's fingers upon his hand, and then shame was replaced by guilty anger as he recalled Jan's confronting him upon the sidewalk in the snow. He was getting tired. The more he came to himself, the more a sense of fatigue seeped into him. He looked down at his clothes. They were damp and crumpled, and the sleeves of his coat were drawn halfway up his arms. His shirt was open, and he could see the black skin of his chest. Suddenly he felt the fingers of his right hand throb with pain. 2 fingernails were torn off. He could not remember how it happened. He tried to move his tongue and found it swollen. His lips were dry and cracked, and he wanted water. He felt giddy. The lights and faces whirled slowly, like a merry-go-round. He was falling swiftly through space. When he opened his eyes, he was stretched up upon a cot. A white face loomed above him. He tried to lift his body and was pushed back. "Take it easy, boy. Here, drink this." A glass touched his lips. Ought he to drink? But what difference did it make? He swallowed something warm. It was milk. When the glass was empty, he lay upon his back and stared at the white ceiling. The memory of Bessie and the milk she had warmed for him came back strongly. Then the image of her death came, and he closed his eyes, trying to forget. His stomach growled. He was feeling better. He heard a low drone of voices. He gripped the edge of the cot and sat up. "Hey, how are you feeling, boy?" "Huh?" he grunted. It was the first time he had spoken since they caught him. "How are you feeling?" He closed his eyes and turned his head away, sensing that they were white, and he was black, and that they were captors, and he was the captive. "He's coming out of it. Yeah, that crowd must have got him. Say, boy, you want something to eat?" He did not answer. "Get him something. He doesn't know what he wants." "You better lie down, boy. You'll have to go back in the inquest this afternoon." He felt their hands pushing him back onto the cot. The door closed. He looked round. He was alone. The room was quiet. He had come out into the world again. He had tried not to. It had just happened. He was being turned here and there by a surge of strange forces he could not understand. It was not to save his life that he had come out. He did not care what they did to him. They could place him in the electric chair right now for all he cared. It was to save his pride that he had come. He did not want them to make sport of him. If they had killed him the night when they were there dragging him down the steps, they would have been a deed born of their strength over him. But he felt that they had no right to sit and watch him, no to use him for whatever they wanted. The door opened and a policeman brought in a tray of food, left it on a chair next to him, and left. There was steak and fried potatoes and coffee. Gingerly he cut a piece of steak and put it into his mouth. It tasted so good that he tried to swallow it before he chewed it. He sat on the edge of the cot and drew the chair forward so that he could reach the food. He ate so fast that his jaws ached. He stopped and held the food in his mouth, feeling the juices of his glands flowing around it. When he was through, he lit a cigarette, stretched out upon the cot, and closed his eyes. He dozed off to an uneasy sleep. Then suddenly he sat upright. He had not seen a newspaper in a long time. What were they saying now? He got up. He swayed and the room lurched. He was still weak and giddy. He leaned against the wall and walked slowly to the door. Cautiously he turned the knob. The door swung in, and he looked into the face of a policeman. "What's the matter, boy?" He saw a heavy gun sagging at the man's hips. The policeman caught him by the wrist and led him back to the cot. "Here, take it easy." "I want a paper," he said. "Huh? A paper?" "I want a paper to read." "Wait a minute, I'll see." The policeman went out and presently returned with an armful of papers. "Here you go, boy. You're in all of them." He did not turn to the papers until after the man had left the room. Then he spread out the Tribune and saw Negro rapist faints at inquest. He understood now. It was the inquest he had been taken to. He had fainted, and they had brought him here. He read, "Overwhelmed by the sight of his accusers, Bigger Thomas, Negro sex slayer, fainted dramatically this morning at the inquest of Mary Dalton, millionaire Chicago heiress." Emerging from a stupor for the first time since his capture last Monday night, the black killer sat cowed and fearful as hundreds sought to get a glimpse of him. "He looks exactly like an ape," exclaimed a terrified young white girl who watched the black slayer being loaded on the stretcher after he had fainted. Though the Negro killer's body does not seem compactly built, he gives the impression of possessing abnormal physical strength. He is about 5 feet 9 inches tall, and his skin is exceedingly black. His lower jaw protrudes obnoxiously, reminding one of a jungle beast. His arms are long, hanging in a dangling fashion to his knees. It is easy to imagine how this man, in the grip of a brain-numbing sex passion, overpowered little Mary Dalton, raped her, murdered her, beheaded her, then stuffed her body in a roaring furnace to destroy the evidence of his crime. His shoulders are huge, muscular, and he keeps them hunched, as if about to spring upon you at any moment. He looks at the world with a strange, sullen, fixed-from-under stare, as though defying all efforts of compassion. All in all, he seems a beast utterly untouched by the softening influence of modern civilization. In speech and manner, he lacks the charm of the average, harmless, genial, grinning Southern darky so beloved by the American people. The moment the killer made his appearance at the inquest, there were shouts of "Lynch him! Kill him!" But the brutish Negro seemed indifferent to his fate, as though inquest, trials, and even the looming certainty of the electric chair held no terror for him. He acted like an earlier missing link in the human species. He seemed out of place in a white man's civilization. An Irish police captain remarked with deep conviction, "I'm convinced that death is the only cure for the likes of him." For 3 days, the Negro has refused all nourishment. Police believe that he's either trying to starve himself to death and cheat the chair, or that he's trying to excite sympathy for him. From Jackson, Mississippi, came a report yesterday from Edward Robertson, editor of the Jackson Daily Star, regarding Bigger Thomas's boyhood there. The editor wired, "Thomas comes of a poor darky family of a shiftless and immoral variety. He was raised here and is known to local residents as an irreformable sneak, thief, and liar. We were unable to send him to the chain gang because of his extreme youth. Our experience here in Dixie with such depraved types of Negroes has shown that only the death penalty, inflicted in a public and dramatic manner, has any influence upon their peculiar mentality. Had the Negro Thomas lived in Mississippi and committed such a crime, no power under heaven could have saved him from death at the hands of the indignant citizens. I think it but proper to inform you that in many quarters it is believed that Thomas, despite his dead black complexion, may have a minor portion of white blood in his veins, a mixture which generally makes for a criminal and intractable nature. Down here in Dixie, we keep Negroes firmly in their places, and we make them know that if they so much as touch a white woman, good or bad, they cannot live. When Negroes become resentful over imagined wrongs, nothing brings them to their senses so quickly as when citizens take the law into their own hands and make an example out of the troublemaking Negro. Crimes such as Bigger Thomas murders could be lessened by segregating all Negroes in parks, playgrounds, cafes, theaters, and streetcars. Residential segregation is imperative. Such measures tend to keep them as much as possible out of direct contact with white women and lessen their attacks against them. We of the South believe that the North encourages Negroes to get more education than they are organically capable of absorbing, with the result that Northern Negroes are generally more unhappy and restless than those of the South. If separate schools were maintained, it would be fairly easy to limit the Negro's education by regulating the appropriation of monies through city, country, and state legislative bodies. Still, another psychological deterrent can be attained by conditioning Negroes so that they have to pay deference to white persons with whom they come in contact. This is done by regulating their speech and actions. We have found that the injection of an element of constant fear has aided us greatly in handling the problem. He lowered the paper. He could not read any more. Yes, of course, they were going to kill him, but they were having a sport with him before they did it. He held very still. He was trying to make a decision, not thinking, but feeling it out. Ought he go back behind the wall? Could he go back now? He felt that he could not. He would not make any effort. now to turn out like the others? Why go forward and meet more hate? He lay in the cot, feeling as if he had that night when his fingers had gripped the icy edges of the water tank under the roving flares of lights, knowing that men crouched below him with guns and tear gas, hearing the screams of sirens and shouting rising thirstily from 10,000 throats. Overcome with drowsiness, he closed his eyes, then opened them abruptly. The door swung in, and he saw a black face. Who was this? A tall, well-dressed black man came forward and paused. Bigger pulled up and leaned on his elbow. The man came all the way to the cot and stretched forth a dingy palm, touching Bigger's hand. My poor boy, may the good Lord have mercy on you. He stared at the man's jet-black suit and remembered who he was. Reverend Hammond, the pastor of his mother's church. And at once he was on guard against the man. He shut his heart and tried to stifle all feelings in him. He feared that the preacher would make him feel remorseful. He wanted to tell him to go, but so closely associated in his mind was the man with his mother and what she stood for that he could not speak. In his feelings, he could not tell the difference between what was the man evoked in him and what he had read in the papers. The love of his own kind and the hate of others made him feel equally guilty now. How you feel, son? The man asked. He did not answer, and the man's voice hurried on. Your ma asked me to come and see you. She wants to come too. The preacher knelt upon the concrete floor and closed his eyes. Bigger clamped his teeth and flexed his muscles. He knew what was coming. Lord Jesus, turn your eyes and look in the heart of this poor sinner. You said mercy always on for it on the bended knee, and you put it out into our hearts and make cups run over. We ask you to put mercy on now, Lord. Put it out for this poor sinner boy who stands in the deep of it. If his sins are as scarlet, Lord, wash him white as snow. Forgive him for whatever he's done, Lord. Let the light of your love guide him in the dark days, and help him who's been trying to help him, Lord. Enter into their hearts and breathe compassion on their spirits. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who died on the cross and gave us the mercy of your love. Amen. Bigger stared unblinkingly at the white wall before him as the preacher's words registered themselves in his consciousness. He knew without listening what they meant. It was the old voice of his mother telling of suffering, of hope, of love beyond this world, and he loathed it because it made him feel as condemned and guilty as the voice of those who hated him. Son, Bigger glanced at the preacher and then away. Forget everything but your soul, son. Take your mind off of everything but eternal life. Forget what the newspapers say. Forget you're black. God looks past your skin and into your soul, son. He's looking on the only part of you that's his. He wants you and he loves you. Give yourself to him. Son, listen to me. Tell me what's going to hear. Tell me a story that'll make your heart glad. Bigger sat very still, listening and not listening. If someone had afterwards asked him to repeat the preacher's words, he would not have been able to do so. But he felt and sensed their meaning. As the preacher talked, there appeared before him a vast, black, silent void, and the images of the preacher swam in that void, grew large and powerful. Familiar images which his mother had given him when he was a child at her knee, images which in turn aroused impulses long dormant, impulses that had been suppressed and sought to shunt from his life. They were images which had given him a reason for living, had explained the world. Now they sprawled before his eyes and seized his emotions in a spell of awe and wonder. And the endless reach of deep murmuring waters upon those whose face was darkness, and there was no form, no shape, no sun, no stars, and no land, and a voice came out of the darkness, and the waters moved to obey, and there emerged slowly a huge spinning ball, and a voice said, Let there be light, and there was light, and it was good light. And the voice said, Let there be a firmament, and the waters parted, and there was a vast space over the waters, which formed in a cloud stretching above the waters, and like an echo the voice came from far away, saying, Let land appear. And with thundering rustling the waters drained off, and mountain peaks reared into view, and there were valleys and rivers, and the voices called the dry land earth, and the water seas, and the earth grew grass and trees and flowers that gave off seed that fell to the earth to grow again, and the earth was lit by the light of 1,000,000 stars, and for the day there was a sun, and for the night there was a moon, and there were days and weeks and months and years, and the voices called out of the twilight, and moving creatures came forth out of the great waters, whales and all kinds of living creeping things. And on the land there were beasts and cattle, and the voice said, Let us make man in our image. And from the dusty earth a man rose up and loomed against the day, and the sun, and after him a woman rose up and loomed against the night, and the moon, and they lived as one, flesh, and there was no pain, no longing, no time, no death, and life was like the flower that bloomed around them in the garden of earth. And out of the clouds came a voice saying, Eat not of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, neither touch it, lest ye die. The preacher's words ceased droning. Bigger looked at him out of the corner of his eye. The preacher's face was black and sad and earnest, and made him feel a sense of deep guilt than what even his murder of Mary had made him feel. He had killed within himself the preacher's haunting picture of life even before he had killed Mary. That had been his first murder. and now the preacher made it walk before his eyes like a ghost in the night, creating within him a sense of exclusion that was as cold as block of ice. Why should this thing rise now to plague him after he had pressed a pillow of fear and hate over its face to smother it to death? To those who wanted to kill him, he was not human, not included in that picture of creation, and that was why he had killed it. To live, he had created a new world for himself, and for that was what he was to die for. Again, the preacher's words seeped into his feelings. Son, you know what the truth was? It was a tree of knowledge. It wasn't enough for man to be like God. He wanted to know why. And all God wanted him to do was bloom like the flowers in the fields, live as children. Man wanted to know why, and he fell from light and darkness, from love and damnation, from blessedness and shame. And God cast him out of the garden, and told the man he had to get his bread by the sweat of his brow, and told the woman she had to bring forth her children in pain and sorrow. The world turned against him, and they had to fight the world for life. The man and the woman walked fearfully among the trees, their hands covering their nakedness, and the back of them high in the twilight against the clouds. An angel waved a flaming sword, dragged them out of the garden into the wild night of cold, and tears and pain and death. And the man and the woman took their food and burnt it to send smoke to the sky, begging for forgiveness. Son, for thousands of years we've been praying to God to take the curse off us. God heard our prayers and said he'd show us a way back to him. His son Jesus came down to earth and put human flesh and lived and he died to show us the way. Jesus let men crucify him, but his death was a victory. He showed us that to live in the world was to be crucified by it, that our world ain't our home. Life every day is a crucifixion. There's only but one way out, son, and that's Jesus, the way of love and forgiveness. Be like Jesus. Don't resist. Thank God that he done chose this for you to come to him. It's love that's got to save you, son. You got to believe that God gives eternal life through the Son of the love of Jesus. Son, look at me. Bigger's black face rested in his hands, and he did not move. Son, promise me you'll stop hating long enough for God's love to come into your heart. Bigger said nothing. Won't you promise, son? Bigger covered his eyes with his hands. Just say you'll try. Bigger felt that if the preacher kept asking, he would leap up and strike him. How could he believe in that which he had killed? He was guilty. The preacher rose, sighed, and drew from his pocket a small wooden cross with a chain upon it. Look, son, I'm holding in my hands a wooden cross taken from a tree. A tree is the world, son, and nailed in this tree is suffering man. That's what life is, son, suffering. How come you keep from believing the word of God when I'm holding before you the eyes, the only thing that gives us meaning to your life? Here, let me put it around your neck. When you get alone, look at this cross, son, and believe it. They were silent. The wooden cross hung next to the skin of Bigger's chest. He was feeling the words of the preacher, feeling that life was flesh nailed to the world, a longing spirit imprisoned in the days of his earth. He glanced up, hearing the doorknob turn. The door opened and Jan stood framed in, hesitating. Bigger sprang to his feet, galvanized by fear. The preacher also stood, took a step backward, bowed, and said, "Good morning, sir." Bigger wondered what Jan could want of him now. Was he not caught and ready for trial? Would not Jan get his revenge? Bigger stiffened as Jan walked to the middle of the floor and stood facing him. Then it suddenly occurred to Bigger that he need not be standing, that he had no reason to fear bodily harm from Jan here in jail. He sat and bowed his head. The room was quiet, so quiet that Bigger heard the preacher and Jan breathing. The white man upon whom he had tried to blame his crime stood before him, and he sat waiting to hear his angry words. Well, why didn't he speak? He lifted his eyes. Jan was looking straight at him, and he looked away. But Jan's face was not angry. If he were not angry, then what did he want? He looked again and saw Jan's lips move to speak, but no words came. And when Jan did speak, his voice was so low, and there were long pauses between the words. It seemed to Bigger that he was listening to a man talk to himself. Bigger, maybe I haven't the words to say what I want to say, but I'm going to try. This thing hit me like a bomb. It took me all week to get myself together. They had me in jail, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what was happening. I don't want to worry you, Bigger. I know you're in trouble, but there's something I just gotta say. You didn't talk to me unless you want to, Bigger. I think I know something of what you're feeling now. I'm not dumb, Bigger. I can understand even if I didn't seem to understand that night. Jan paused, swallowed, and lit a cigarette. Well, you jarred me. I see now. I was kind of blind. I just wanted to come here and tell you that I'm not angry. I'm not angry, and I want you to let me help you. I don't hate you for trying to blame this thing on me. Maybe you had good reason. I don't know. And maybe in a certain sense, I'm the one who's really guilty. Jan paused again and sucked long and hard on his cigarette, blew the smoke out slowly and nervously bit his lips. Bigger, I've never done anything against you and your people in my life, but I'm a white man, and it would be asking too much to ask you not to hate me when every white man you see hates you. I know my face looks like theirs to you, even though I don't feel like they do. But I didn't know we were so far apart until that night. I can understand now why you pulled that gun on me when I waited outside the house to talk to you. It was the only thing you could have done. But I didn't know my white face was making you feel guilty, condemning you. Jan's lips hung open, but no words came from them. His eyes searched the corner of the room. Bigger sat silently. Bewildered, feeling that he was on a vast blind wheel being turned by stray gusts of wind, the preacher came forward. Is you Mr. Alone? Yes, said Jan, turning. That was a fine, mighty thing that you just said, sir. If everybody needs help, this poor boy does. I'm Reverend Hammond. Bigger saw Jan and the preacher shake hands. Though this thing hurt me, I got something out of it, Jan said, sitting down and turning to Bigger. It makes me see deeper into men. It made me see things I knew but had forgotten. I lost something, but I got something too. Jan tugged at his tie and the room was silent, waiting for him to speak. It taught me that you're right to hate me, Bigger. I see now that you couldn't do anything else but that. It was all you had. But Bigger, if I say you got the right to hate me, then that ought to make things a little different, oughtn't it? Ever since I was out of jail, I've been thinking this thing over, and I feel like I'm the one who ought to be in jail for murder instead of you. But that can't be, Bigger. I can't take upon myself the blame for what was 100 million people have done. Jan leaned forward and stared at the floor. I'm not trying to make up to you, Bigger. I didn't come here to feel sorry for you. I don't suppose you're so much worse off than the rest of us who get tangled up in this world. I'm here because I'm trying to live up to this thing as I see it, and it isn't easy, Bigger. I loved the girl you killed. I loved. His voice broke, and Bigger saw his lips tremble. I was in jail grieving for Mary, and then I thought of all the black men who have been killed, the black men who had to grieve when their people were snatched from them in slavery and since slavery. I thought if they could stand it, then I ought to. Jan crushed the cigarette with a shoe. At first I thought the old man Dalton was trying to frame me, and I wanted to kill him. And then when I heard that you'd done it, I wanted to kill you. And then I got to thinking. I saw if I killed, this thing would go on and never stop. I said, I'm going to help that guy if he lets me. May God in heaven bless you, son, the preacher said. Jan lit another cigarette and offered one to Bigger, but Bigger refused by keeping his hands folded in front of him and staring stonily at the floor. Jan's words were strange. He had never heard such talk before. The meaning of what Jan said was so new that he could not react to it. He simply sat, staring, wondering, afraid even to look at Jan. Let me be on your side, Bigger, Jan said. I can fight this thing with you, just like you started it. I've come in from all those white people and stand here with you. Listen, I got a friend, a lawyer. His name is Max. He understands this thing and wants to help you. Won't you talk to him? Bigger understood that Jan was not holding him guilty for what he had done. Was this a trap? He looked at Jan and saw a white face, but an honest face. The white man believed in him, and the moment he felt the belief, he felt guilty again, but in a different sense now. Suddenly this white man had come up to him, flung aside the curtain, and walked in the room of his life. Jan had spoken a declaration of friendship that would make other white men hate him. A particle of white rock had detached itself from the looming mountain of white hate and had rolled down the slope, stopping still at his feet. The world had become flesh. For the first time in his life, a white man became a human being to him, and the reality of Jan's humanity came in to stab him of remorse. He had killed what this man loved and had hurt him. He saw Jan as though someone had performed an operation upon his eyes, or as though someone had snatched a deforming mask from Jan's face. Bigger stared nervously. The preacher's hand came to his shoulder. And I don't want to break in the middle here where it ain't got no business, sir, the preacher said in a tone that was militant but deferring. There ain't no use in dragging no communists in this thing, mister. I respect your feelings powerfully, sir, but what you just to stir up more hate. What this poor boy need is understanding. But what he's got to fight for, Jan said. I'm with you when you want to change men's hearts, the preacher said, but I can go with you when you want to stir up more hate. Bigger sat looking from one to the other, bewildered. How on earth are you going to change men's hearts when the newspapers are fanning hate into them every day, Jan asked. God can change them, the preacher said fervently. Jan turned to Bigger. Won't you let me help you, Bigger?